everybody's voice can be heard.
Welcome to the show. My name is Dennis Etler, and our special guest tonight is Regina Langhout, who is a professor of psychology at the University of California, Santa Cruz. So welcome.
Thank you.
Pleasure to have you. So tonight we're going to be discussing an upcoming event locally here in Santa Cruz, presented by the United Nations Association of Santa Cruz County. And it's our annual celebration of United Nations Day. The United Nations was founded 74 years ago on October 24th in San Francisco. And next year will be its 75th anniversary, but we celebrate this day on an annual basis, just to focus in on the role that the UN plays, both internationally, but also nationally and even on a local level. So our organization has a number of activities throughout the year, focusing primarily on human rights and other issues that the UN champions. And this UN Day, we are going to focus on another special anniversary, which is the 30th anniversary of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. Now, many people might not be familiar with that. It was passed in 1989 by the UN General Assembly and ratified subsequently by nearly every country in the world, except one. Unfortunately, our nation, while we signed it, it's never been submitted to the Senate, which needs to ratify it for it to go into effect. So, in point of fact, we are the only nation in the world that has not ratified this convention. The convention outlines 41 articles delineating the rights of the child. And of course, we're not going to be able to go over all of that, but we are going to focus tonight particularly on the issue of family separations. Now, this is an issue, of course, that has garnered many headlines and generated a considerable amount of controversy here in our own country. And our UN Day will be specifically looking at that issue in the context of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. So I have a number of questions that I'd like to address to Professor Langhout, who actually has studied this very issue in depth. And we think, she might have some very useful information to convey to our audience. Well, you are the lead author on a policy brief on the effects of forced family separation and deportation. The policy brief is the official document of the Society for Community Research and Action, which is a division of the American Psychological Association. So it sounds like you are really quite involved and conversant in this very issue. Well, first off, could you tell us a little bit more about what the effects of family separations are on children?
Sure. Thank you for the question. This is a really hard topic to talk about because the effects on children are really severe. And so I think we need to remember that. And before I go through the different kinds of effects, I want to point out that approximately 10% of children who are in the US are actually from mixed status families. So that means there's at least one person in the family who does not have authorization to be in the US. So if we think about the border states, we have to assume that the numbers are higher. So I want to point that out first because what I'm about to talk about in terms of the effects on children it affects many, many children, and many children in the state of California, and many children in our community. So I'm going to break the effects down into three basic types of effects. There are psychological effects, there are school-related effects, and economic effects. When there is some kind of forced family separation and deportation, sometimes happening right after a raid, sometimes happening not right after a raid. So in terms of the psychological effects, children experience a lot of really negative consequences, such as eating disturbances, sleeping disturbances. They tend to get very depressed. They tend to have a lot of anxiety. They can kind of turn inward, a lot of crying, a lot of isolation, withdrawal, fear, and also a very deep sense of abandonment. And because when this happens, it often happens very quickly. There's a lot of attachment sort of issues that can arise. So just being separated just so quickly from a parent can lead to a lot of separation anxiety and a lot of other attachment kinds of issues. And this research, I want to point out from the policy brief, my co-authors and I, we researched what's in the psychological literature over the last 30 years. So this is really looking at sort of these long-term effects as well, and from sort of policy change to policy change in the US. So we know this from this literature. So those are the psychological effects. There are also academic effects for children. They tend to withdraw from school and to essentially not engage as much in schooling and not do as well. There are problems with persistence and retention as well. And then there are also economic effects, and these tend to be cascading and rippling. So oftentimes when somebody is deported in the US, what the research shows, and these are governmental statistics, is that it tends to be men who are deported. So if it's the case that there's a child in the family and they are from a straight couple, then usually in the US, because of inequities in pay, usually what ends up happening is that the family's income goes down really considerably as the man is deported. And so usually the family loses from 40 to 90% of their income, and the average is about 70%. And so that is actually going to lead to a lot of housing instability, especially in an area like ours where the rents are so high, food insecurity. If the children are a little bit older and there are younger children in the household, they often need to pull back from maybe like after school activities and participate in childcare. If they're older, they might have to get a job and to help support the family. So they also often have less contact then with their mom, who often has to get a second or a third job in order to keep a roof over the head. So the effects are really terrible and long-term. And so in terms of the policy brief, the most long-term research we were able to find so far is about 2 years out. And these effects continue for children and their families even that far out.
Yeah. Just to elaborate a bit, what are the long-term developmental effects on the physical well-being of the child? And something along the lines of post-traumatic stress syndrome. Is that a recurring problem as well?
Yeah, this can absolutely happen and absolutely be the case. And so for children, there are long-term effects that are associated with trauma, especially if there is something like a raid that happens in a community. Then we're really looking at a heightened sense of post-traumatic stress. And we know that families in general, oftentimes we see more problems with heart disease. We see more problems with diabetes. With children, especially with food insecurity, there can be problems with not getting enough in terms of proper nutrition for young children.
So these effects are going to be lifetime effects in many, many occasions.
Unfortunately, yes.
Excuse me. Well, we have some more questions here. Besides the effects on children, of course, the effects on the broader community.
Yeah.
So maybe if you could address that issue.
Yeah, sure. I think it's something that we tend to forget about in terms of thinking about more broadly what happens, and this is a really important issue for the Society for Community Research and Action, which is the group that has published the policy brief that I'm the lead author on. And that group, it's essentially the community psychology division of the American Psychological Association. And that's important because community psychologists are a group that are really interested in thinking about community health and well-being, and that's our area. And so if you think about all of psychology, we're the folks who are interested in kind of like the public health wing of psychology in many ways. And so what we know is that in reviewing this literature, and it's spelled out in the policy brief, that essentially when there's a raid, when there are deportations, everybody in that community becomes very fearful. And it means that people start to mistrust public services. So somebody might be having a pretty severe health issue that would require going to the emergency room, and they won't go to the emergency room, or they won't seek medical care at that point because of the fear of what it means to engage in these public services. We know that people also will refuse to call the police even if they are the victim of a crime. And it's not just people who don't have papers who have this kind of effect. It can be anybody in the community. So there's a real fear of bringing some kind of state presence back into the community. Even if there are households where every single person has documentation, even if every single person is born in the US, there's still a fear of calling the police in these situations. So the effects are really rippling and wide term. We know that people stop using social and public services. So this might mean that people stop going to religious services, they stop going to the park, they stop going to after-school events at their child's school. There's really a pulling back from civic engagement. And as community psychologists, we know that as civic engagement decreases, social isolation increases. And this has negative effects for our entire community because essentially the social fabric of a democracy is really set on everybody being able to participate in our society. And kind of what a democracy is founded on is this idea that when we're all engaged and all civically and publicly involved, we're going to come up with the best solutions because everybody's voice can be heard. So when we are living in a society where whole groups of people are afraid to engage and are not able to be involved, that weakens the fabric of our entire society. And we also know from that what ends up happening is that when we have these vast inequities in our society, it's bad for the health and well-being of every single person in that society. So even if I am not living in a neighborhood that's being targeted through deportations or a raid, I am more likely to have negative psychosocial effects. I'm more likely to experience depression. I'm more likely to have bad physical health outcomes because of these huge inequities in our society. So it really affects all of us.
You speak about our democracy and the fabric of democracy. Doesn't this also have an effect on participation in civic institutions like the census and voting rights and the like?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a lot of people talking right now about the importance of the census and the importance of being counted. I know that United We Dream is really trying to make sure that people know that it's okay to be counted. And obviously that matters a lot because the census also decides how much political representation and power we're going to have. So these are other ways.
Voting rights as well, because people might be dissuaded from actually utilizing their right to vote because of their fears.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I have another question. In terms of how this plays out right here in Santa Cruz. Now, there have been ICE raids here in Santa Cruz, and of course, we do have a large community of Latinx people, many of which are assumably here without the paperwork that required. So what can you say about the effects of all this on our local situation?
Yeah. So I think that's an important question to ask. I have not empirically studied this myself, but I have been in many different places where I have seen what's going on. And it's been really fascinating and heartbreaking to work on this policy brief and then to see these effects happening right here locally in our community. Even a place that, has the city of Santa Cruz has passed an ordinance saying that we are a sanctuary city, even in that kind of case. So for example, I've been working with a graduate student on a paper now, and we have been going back to the 2 city council meetings that happened right after the February 2017 raid. And anybody can go to the City Council website, and all of the videos from past City Council meetings are posted on that website. So anybody can go and look at that and see what's there. And we've been examining what's been spoken in the open comments in the City Council meeting the day after the raid in February 2017, so that would have been the 14th. And people are talking in ways that are very much aligned with the policy brief. And it's really tragic and heartbreaking to hear what they have to say. So they talk about things like children just uncontrollably crying for hours. They talk about the fact that during that raid, what happened is there were helicopters flying very low overhead starting around 4 a.m. And there were flash grenades thrown into people's homes that had children in them. There were windows that were broken. There were doors that were broken down that affected many, many, many people. And so people stood up at that meeting and talked about, as I mentioned, children crying uncontrollably. They talked about children not going to school, being too afraid to leave their homes. They talked about, healthcare providers stood up and talked about the huge number of cancellation of appointments. People stood up and talked about how some people didn't have food in their houses and they did not want to leave to go and get food because out of fear. So this has been had a really big effect in our community, and it's documented just by going through and listening to those city council meetings that happened right after these raids. So we know that from the 2017 raids. My research team and I are just finishing up an after-school program that we've been running for about 12 years. And we work with 9 to 12-year-old children in that program. And after the raid, the young people in our program also kept talking about the raid. And it didn't matter what the topic was that we had for that day, they just kept bringing it up. So we might have been doing a lesson on Dia de los Muertos, and the children know what this is about, yet they kept talking about people who they could no longer see, who had been, who are now on the other side of the border. So children in our community, and this was months later, so children in our community are really still hurting from these raids. We know from the 2019, the February 2019 raid that happened, I had an opportunity to meet the girl who was in the house that had the flash grenades thrown in it. She was 10 at the time, she's 11 now. This has been several months. She is still experiencing vision problems, hearing problems, not wanting to sleep at night because the raid happened again at around 4 a.m. When it was dark outside. So being afraid to go to school, being afraid to leave her parents' side. So these effects are right here in our community, and really tragic for young people and for everybody in our community.
Yes, just to emphasize, what we read in the headlines and see on the nightly news is actually happening right here in Santa Cruz. Mm-hmm. So I would like to continue on, and what can we do as members of this community? How can people living here in Santa Cruz help those who have been impacted by what's been going on?
So I want to talk about an answer to this question at sort of 4 levels. I want to talk about the national level, what we can do as a city, what we can do with our schools, and then what we can just do as individuals in our everyday life. So at the national level, I think it's important that we advocate for the ratification of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. Article 9 says that children should not be separated from their parents. It says that if they are separated, they have a right to regular contact. And it says that if they are separated, they have a right to know where their parents are. And that is not always happening right now. So ratifying the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child would be one way that we could start to think more about what are the rights and protections that all children are due. We could also advocate for comprehensive immigration reform and a path to citizenship for all people who are here. It's important to know that by US government statistics, the person who is deported, who is in the US, the median time that they have been in the US is for 14 years. These are our neighbors. These are our long-term neighbors that we're talking about. So making sure that there's a path to citizenship for everybody is also something that's really important. We need to advocate for policies that don't separate children from their families as well. So those are things that we can advocate for at the national level. At the city level, if we're thinking about our own municipality, we can make sure that there are no 287G agreements that are signed between the city police and the Department of Homeland Security. And we already in Santa Cruz, I've been told that there is no 287G agreement. So I want to be clear about that first, but that's not the case everywhere. And a 287G agreement essentially says that local law enforcement can serve as immigration enforcement. And so that creates a lot of problems for the reasons that I was talking about earlier in terms of people need to be able to call the police if they are the victim of a crime. And so when there's that kind of participation and cooperation, that's much less likely to happen. So we need to just essentially make sure that our police is not cooperating with Department of Homeland Security. And it's the kind of thing that we have to constantly be making sure that that isn't happening. Just hearing it one time a year ago is not sufficient. We need to advocate for culturally sensitive and readily available social and public health services in our community. Providers need to be bilingual and bicultural, and both of those pieces are really important because it's really hard for people for any social group that is afraid to actually reach out to resources. It's really important that those resources be welcoming to these communities when people do actually reach out, or else there's a fear that they will not reach out again or not continue to receive those resources. Also, the city could create a department in collaboration with immigrants to serve immigrant family needs. So oftentimes the way that city government works is that there's not really a strong sense of who's responsible to make sure that immigrant communities' needs are being met. So having something that can assist with that and help with that.
Okay, well, just to sum up then, we can ask, how has this policy brief been received at the various levels in which it's been distributed?
Mm-hmm. So the policy brief, there are a lot of people who are interested in it. So there's been, it's been reaching very broad audiences. So when it first came out, the Sentinel reached out to me and asked me to write an op-ed, which I did. There was also an op-ed from one of my co-authors in Alaska. There's been some media attention from here throughout the state of California, all the way to Miami. There's been some national media attention as well, such as Common Dreams, for example. I've given about 10 talks across the region to mental health care providers and to other groups as well, who are just interested to know what's going on, what do these results tell us, and what can we do locally. Also, there are now some immigration attorneys who are starting to use the brief to try to help stop a deportation. And elected city officials have been reaching out to me and asking me for the policy brief, since we also have some recommendations for them in terms of what can be done.
Well, thank you so much, Regina, for edifying us on this really very, very important issue that's confronting our nation and our city. Professor Langhout will be a panelist on UN Day, which will be celebrated on October 19th at the Resource Center for Nonviolence, 612 Ocean Street from 1 till 4. She'll be a member of a panel consisting of individuals who have experience with this issue and the issue of the rights of the child. So we look forward to having you on the panel. There will also be local organizations tabling at this event. And if you're interested in getting involved in organizations who are trying to address the issue of family separation and the rights of the child, please come to the event and get to know those who are actively engaged. There will also be refreshments and entertainment as well. There'll be a folkloric dance ensemble and other performers, short videos. Of course, there will be the panel discussion and perhaps others who would like to speak to the issues at hand. So again, thank you so much, Regina, for participating in this opportunity to present to our community what's going on with family separation here in Santa Cruz and across the nation.
Thank you for the invitation.
The UN promotes maternal health.
The UN combats climate change.
The UN helps people in emergencies.
The UN works for peace.
The UN fights poverty.
The UN vaccinates children.
The UN feeds hungry populations.
The UN assists refugees.
The UN promotes human rights.
The UN promotes disarmament.
The UN works for primary education for all.
The UN works to prevent conflict.
Happy birthday, United Nations.